Connecting a BLHeli32 ESC to a flight controller is hard enough. Oh, sure. If you've got a flight controller and ESC that were designed to work together, then you just plug them together and that's it. But if you've got like just some random ESC that wasn't intended to go with a flight controller, you've got to take a look at all these wires coming out of the ESC, and then you got to figure out where they go on the flight controller. And it's not the end of the world, but the one that always trips people up is this one, ESC Telemetry. In this video, I'm going to tell you what ESC Telemetry actually does, and then I'm going to tell you why you kind of don't need it in this day and age. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Here's the problem that ESC Telemetry is designed to solve. Normally, the communication between a flight controller and an ESC is one way. The flight controller tells the ESC how fast it wants the motor to spin, and that's it. But the ESC has certain information that the flight controller could want to know, and ESC Telemetry was invented as a way of letting the ESC talk back to the flight controller. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking about bi-directional DShot, which is also a way that the ESC talks back to the flight controller, but ESC Telemetry is not bi-directional DShot. We'll get to that a little later in the video. So take a look at this. This is the JBF4, and the JBF4 was designed for use with individual ESCs. This was pretty much before 4-in-1 ESCs became like just the de facto that everyone used. And you can see on each of the ESC pads on the corner of the flight controller, there is an RX4. So the way ESC Telemetry works is all of the ESCs have a telemetry wire. The telemetry wire is connected to a UART RX pad on the flight controller. And if you think about it, if each ESC had to go to its own UART, then a quadcopter would need 4 separate UARTs, one for each of the ESCs. So the devs were very smart. What they did was they said you're just going to wire all the ESCs to the same UART RX pad, and the flight controller then pulls the ESCs in what's called round robin style. So the flight controller says, ESC number 1, send me your telemetry. ESC number 2, send me your telemetry. And since at any given time only one device is talking, then the fact that they're all hooked, normally you only hook one thing to each UART, right? But in this case, they've specially designed it so you hook all the ESCs to the same UART, no matter how many ESCs you have. The flight controller pulls the ESCs round robin style and gets the information from them. What information does it get? This is where we start to touch on why ESC Telemetry is actually not really that big a deal these days. ESC Telemetry can carry these information elements. Number 1, the RPM of the motor. Oh, that's actually kind of a big deal. Yes, but no. Because the RPM of the motor is also carried by bidirectional DShot. And the reason that, why was bidirectional DShot even invented? Isn't it just redundant? No, because ESC Telemetry, the ESCs are pulled round robin style, and they're only pulled so fast. So actually, the RPM information it's kind of useful if you just as a pilot kind of want to know how fast your motor is spinning. But for something like RPM filtering, which needs very, very low latency data, ESC Telemetry just isn't fast enough. And that's why bidirectional DShot was invented. Bidirectional DShot, the signal wire that sends the throttle information between the flight controller and the ESC via DShot, also carries RPM information back, and it's every single packet of information. You get the RPM information back. So RPM can be carried by ESC Telemetry, but actually bidirectional DShot does it, and it does it better, and it does it faster, and that's why you kind of don't need it anymore. The next piece of information that can be carried by ESC Telemetry is battery voltage. And you can see here in the Power and Battery tab of Betaflight, I can set my voltage meter source to be ESC sensor. And what that's going to do is the flight controller will read the battery voltage from the ESC instead of from its own internal sensor. And here's why that's pretty useless most of the time. Because basically all flight controllers have an internal voltage sensor that just senses the battery voltage. So why would you need the ESC to do it? The answer is if you have a quadcopter that is running on higher than 6S voltage, most flight controllers can't handle higher than 6S voltage. And as a result, the workaround for that is to use the ESC sensor. Your ESC will be running on 12S or 8S or 14S or whatever your voltage is, and of course the ESC is designed to take that. The ESC will then report that voltage back to the flight controller via ESC telemetry, even though the flight controller is being powered from a voltage regulator like a 12-volt regulator, since the flight controller couldn't take the 8S or 12S or 14S natively. So this is a case where ESC telemetry, a rare case where it might still be useful, but for most of us who are running quadcopters on 6S or below, it doesn't really matter. The next piece of information that ESC telemetry can carry is current. That is the number of amps that the motors are pulling. And of course, amps that the motors are pulling is a super useful piece of information to have. But here's the thing. This is the old Bardwell ESC that was sold with the JBF4. And what I want you to see is that these resistors here, these are shunt resistors, and they are used as part of the current sensor circuit. And I want you to see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 of these shunt resistors. The way that ESC telemetry works is each individual ESC measures its own current that it is pulling, and then it reports the amount of the number of amps that the motor is pulling via ESC telemetry. Well, there's 4 ESCs. Each one is measuring its own current, and then the flight controller adds that up together to get the total current that the motors are pulling. Now that's fine if you've got individual ESCs, but if you've got a 4-in-1 ESC, the manufacturers realized that that's pretty dumb. And what they did is they put a single shunt resistor here at the main battery leads to measure the current, like just all the current coming into the ESC. And why would you, if you've got a 4-in-1 ESC, why do you need 4 separate current sensors? Just have one current sensor right there at the battery lead and you're good to go. By the way, technically that is 2 separate resistors. They're just in parallel with each other. They're acting like one resistor, but you get the point. Now, when you've got a single current sensor like this, ESC telemetry doesn't carry the current data. In fact, when you've got a single current sensor like this, the information is output as an analog signal via this current wire coming out of the ESC. And in your flight controller, you would set the current meter source to onboard ADC, and your flight controller would have a current sense wire input that would receive that current sense signal from the ESC and would give you the current. And this was super confusing to me the first time that I ran into it, because the ESC is still doing ESC telemetry. It's just not including the current sense data in the ESC telemetry. So if you go into Betaflight and you set one of these ESCs, that set the current meter source to ESC sensor, ESC telemetry will be working. You'll just see 0 amps and it's just not including it. So long story short, as we moved from individual ESCs to 4-in-1 ESCs, it was more effective to have it was cheaper to have a single shunt resistor, a single current sensor for the whole ESC. And since ESC telemetry wants a single current sensor for each of the 4 ESCs, it was basically, we moved away from using ESC telemetry to report current data. And we basically always just use that current sense input wire. And we don't use ESC telemetry for that. What else does ESC report? ESC RPM, RPM frequency. Oh, temperature. It reports temperature. Now, that sounds kind of useful at first, but what we'd really like to know is the temperature of the motor, so we can know if we're like about to smoke a motor. In general, an ESC isn't going to overheat most of the time unless you're just dramatically over amping it, and you'll know that by watching the current, not by watching the temperature. So also, it's measuring the temperature of the MCU, not the temperature of the FETs, and it's really the temperature of the FETs that you'd want to know. So temperature may be kind of useful, but most of the time you can certainly live without it. And that brings us to the end of the video, and the reason why ESC telemetry is basically useless for most people today. Because of the information that ESC telemetry carries, RPM, voltage, current, and temperature, most of those have been supplanted by some other way of getting the same information, or in the case of temperature, it's not information you really care about most of the time anyway. So if you're trying to set up a flight controller or an ESC and you are worried about, oh, should I get ESC telemetry working? Probably you don't need it. That's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Happy flying. What are you doing in here? The least you could do is subscribe or join my Patreon, or like, just here's another video I picked out for you. Jeez.